In this video, we'll demonstrate how the Maccabean revolt proves early authorship to Daniel. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell to stay up to date as new videos come out, and if you're interested in supporting this ministry, just go to justscripture.org and click on the support page. In part 2 of our Daniel 8 study, we'll be focusing in on a special character that arises out of one of the 4 subkingdoms of Greece. You can see that there is more attention given to the little horn than to the ram and goat that represent the Medo-Persian and the Greek empires. On our chart, we saw how the ram and goat perfectly align themselves with the second and third empires. Like chapters 2 and 7, where we received first a broad picture of the Gentile empires, but then the text zoomed in and focused on the last 10 kings of the fourth empire. Here too, chapter 8 focuses in on one character that comes from the 4 subkingdoms. From the interpretation and recorded history, we know who these 4 subkingdoms of the Greek Empire were. So let's now continue with Daniel's vision, verse 9. And out of one of the 4 subkingdoms came forth a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the pleasant land. And it, the little horn, waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of hosts, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. Notice that the little horn is now identified as an individual male. Verse 12. And an host was given to him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Now, if all that Elizabethan language was a little bit confusing to you, don't worry, we'll clean it up. But so far, we can easily tell that this little horn is somebody who causes a lot of damage. And from verse 23, we know that he is a king. In verse 9, it said that he grew in power in the south, the east, and even in the pleasant land. From Jeremiah 3, we know that the pleasant land is referring to the broad land of Israel, but in more particular case, it is about Jerusalem, because of the other references in Daniel. This makes sense because in verse 11, it spoke about how he will be allowed to stop the daily sacrifices that are conducted at the temple. I say allowed because by him literally means from him, meaning that God is the one that is allowing for this king to do this type of damage. So think of it as God removing his protective hand over Israel that leaves them wide open for attack. Now with this, we know that in verse 12, that the reference to the host is in reference to the Jews that will be given into his hand. This corrects any type of confusion from verse 10 about who the stars are to be identified with. Since this verse seemed celestial in its language, that it may have come across about speaking as to the heavenly beings or angels, but star language has been used before for the Israelites back in Genesis with Abraham's covenant and Joseph's dream about his brothers bowing down to him. And when we get to Daniel 12, we'll see that faithful Jews are identified with stars as well. But why is God allowing for this to happen? The reason is found right after in verse 12 that says, by reason of transgression. This could be referring to transgressions of the Jews that had reached to a point where God has now allowed them to be punished for similar to that of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But also it could be referring to a particular transgression that this king does that is alluded to in verse 13. But before that, we see that there are 2 more things that this king does. Here it says that he casts down the truth to the ground, and the source of truth for the Jews is the Torah. So this king goes also after God's word, which is connected to the other detail in verse 11, that he magnifies himself even to the prince of the host. So he elevates himself to the same degree or rank as the prince of hosts. But who is that? Well, the word for prince is in reference to a protector of people or a captain or commander of an army. So this prince of the host is referring to the captain of the host of the Lord. This phrase was used back in Joshua 5:13 through 15 that says, "And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And he said, No, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto thy servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for thou, the place where thou standest, is holy. And Joshua did so." Notice how Joshua worshipped this figure. Rule 1 for Israel is not to worship anyone other than Yahweh. And at the bottom, the captain told Joshua to remove his sandals because he was on holy ground. This is what was said to Moses at the burning bush scene. And we know that it is God who is calling out to Moses. But we learn that the angel of the Lord was the one speaking out of the bush, which drew the conclusion that the angel of the Lord is God himself, that visibly shows up numerous times throughout the Old Testament. So, the captain, or prince of hosts, is God, who the little horn magnifies himself to being, meaning he will declare himself as God. Now this plays into everything that we've discussed so far throughout Daniel. We just saw how the captain of the host, the angel of the Lord, and God from the burning bush scene are one and the same. But since we know that this is the visible Yahweh, that we can put together the other pieces that are collectively talking about the same divine figure here. Now, I can understand some people out there hesitating to this and thinking that I'm inappropriately stretching the text here. But look at the middle piece with Yahweh who draws his sword to slay the fourth beast. We just saw how the commander of the host, with his sword drawn, with Joshua falling down and worshiping him. And there's one story that really welds all these pieces together, and that's Balaam and the donkey with the angel of the Lord in Numbers 22. Because Balaam encounters the angel of the Lord with his sword drawn in his hand. The angel is preventing Balaam from cursing Israel, so he is again protecting them like he did many times before this. Then, in verse 31, Yahweh opens Balaam's eyes to see the angel of the Lord with his sword drawn. But look at the last line. Balaam bows down to the ground with his face in a very reverent worshiping position like Joshua did before. Then tells the angel that he has sinned, to which the angel then tells Balaam that he must only speak the words that he tells him to speak, in which Balaam does, but look at who he says puts the words in his mouth. He said it was God. So Balaam here is saying that the angel of the Lord with his sword drawn is God himself. Verses 13 and 14. Then I heard one of the saints, a holy one, speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spoke, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So it appears that the little horn's havoc ends after 2,300 days with the temple being cleansed. But this prophecy also provides Daniel and other future Jews that read of this king's persecution is that it will not go on indefinitely. Now, figuring out historically who this figure was is really not challenging at all. Antiochus IV ruled in the Seleucid Empire. His rule lasted just over 11 years. Now, the name Antiochus wasn't his actual real birth name, but just a throne name that he took on. His real name was Mithridates, and his journey to the throne is a very interesting one. He was the third son of Antiochus the Great. His father's claim to fame was with his expansion of the Seleucid Empire. but also his ability to hold back the Roman Republic for a period of time. In 193 BC, the oldest brother died, and a year later, Dad waged war against Rome, but was not successful at all, to which he had to sign the Treaty of Apamea that was a heavy war penalty. But for the Romans to keep Antiochus the Great from revolting again, they took Antiochus Epiphanes back to Rome as a hostage, where he remained for nearly 15 years. Dad eventually died, and his older brother, Seleucus IV, became the king. Seleucus had two sons by 175 BC, Demetrius, who was age 10 at this point, and a newborn named Antiochus. Rome saw it best to swap hostages by holding Demetrius, who was Seleucus's heir to the throne, for Antiochus. But as Antiochus was on his way back, Seleucus's own official, Heliodorus, assassinated him and declared himself the king. Upon hearing this, Antiochus Epiphanes found support from King Eumenes of Pergamum to overthrow Heliodorus and declared himself as co-regent with his nephew Antiochus instead of Demetrius, who was now in Rome and was the rightful king to the throne. Eventually, though, Antiochus Epiphanes killed his nephew and claimed sole rulership of the kingdom. Awesome head knowledge, but how does this benefit us? Well, think about this from the critical view. They really want Greece to be the fourth empire and the book to culminate with the times and events of Antiochus Epiphanes. Because of this narrative here, some will try to say that this is how Antiochus Epiphanes is the little horn from the Daniel 7. There, it is said that the 11th king would subdue 3 kings. In the critic's mind, that these 3 kings can now be understood as Heliodorus, Demetrius, and little Antiochus. Yeah, but what about those other 7? There weren't 7 other contemporary kings at this time. Correct, but the critics discard that interpretation and opt to say that those 7 are represented by the kings prior to Antiochus Epiphanes. So you would already have 7, then Heliodorus would make 8, little Antiochus would be 9, and Demetrius is the 10th. Thus, Antiochus Epiphanes is the 11th. This kind of seems like a possible solution for them, right? But hopefully you were raising an eyebrow at this and thinking how this clearly violates the text and even what history records. First, the 11th king is said to arise after them. So it is very clear that the 10 kings were to be before the 11th king. You could technically say that Heliodorus was before Antiochus, even though his usurped rule was extremely short. But you cannot say that with either Demetrius or the infant Antiochus. Demetrius eventually became the king after Antiochus Epiphanes died. And with little Antiochus, he was made co-ruler at the same time. His rule didn't come prior to his uncle's. And plus, do you really think killing an infant fits the text here? Next, this clearly is an inconsistent interpretation of Daniel 7 to make it fit in their own view. Critics first descend vertically in their interpretation, then turn horizontally and pick 3 characters that they can construct a word salad narrative to make it look like Antiochus was the 11th king. Sorry, critics, but you're simply cheating the text, which they have to do to make themselves think that their view is correct. But why counting first vertically then horizontally textually fails is because of the imagery of the 10 toes on the statue and the 10 horns on the 4th beast. They are clearly described existing at the same time. Your toes do not grow one after another. They're all horizontally flat on the ground at the same time. But again, the critic won't care about this. They'll just say Daniel was wrong, which all you have to do is say back to them, then the book would have never been entered into the canon if it is wrong. Next, they would have to shift back the ram and goat and declare that the Medo-Persian Empire is the second empire and Greece is the third. This at least cleans up the contradictions and the historical ones that they created between Daniel 2 and 7 for the second and third empires. But now they are declaring that the Seleucid Empire is the fourth. So I hope you're already catching some oddities that will come from this view. First, they still have the 3 strikes at the bottom because of the 10 concurrent kings. On the historical side, they are now saying that the 3rd and 4th empires were in existence at the same time, ending both in 163 BC, which historically is simply not true for either of them. The Seleucid Empire went on for another 100 years, and technically, the Greek Empire lasted until 30 BC, with the Ptolemies in Egypt as the last ones to fall to Rome. So historically, you now have the 3rd beast outliving the 4th. Next, the Seleucid Empire was never divided in half, as Daniel 2 said it would be. Then, the really bizarre part of this interpretation for them is that they would say that one of the 4 heads on the leopard mutated into the 4th beast by separating itself from the 3rd. And since they both say that the little horns from Daniel 2 and 8 represent Antiochus Epiphanes, they would have to say that somehow he magically emerged from both the 3rd and 4th beasts. So even though they clean up their mess with the Second Empire, all they end up doing was creating numerous other textual and historical problems by making the Seleucids the 4th. So how did Antiochus fulfill Daniel 8? Our best sources for the events of Antiochus' reign come from 1 Maccabees chapters 1 through 6, 2 Maccabees chapters 1 through 10, and Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, book 12, chapters 4 through 9. There are unique details and stories found in each of them, so there is benefit from reading each account to get a whole view of his dealings. As Antiochus claimed the throne, 1 Maccabees said, "In those days came there forth out of Israel transgressors of the law, and persuaded many, saying, Let's go and make a covenant with the Gentiles that are round about us. For since we were parted from them, many evils have befallen us. And the saying was good in their eyes." Sounds a lot like Judges when people did everything right in their own eyes, doesn't it? But here we see Jewish transgression of the law. 1 Maccabees continues saying, "And they made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the Gentiles, and sold themselves to do evil." If you don't circumcise your children on the 8th day, according to the Abrahamic covenant, you have now declared yourself to be outside of the commonwealth of Israel. You just chose the world over Yahweh by doing so. And after this, 1 Mac records Antiochus going after Egypt, where initially he succeeded taking many cities and treasures for himself. This fulfills him growing great towards the south, but as he went towards Alexandria, Josephus said that the Romans told him to get out, which meant that they threatened him with war and high taxes if they did so. Plus, it would be in their best interest not to let Antiochus get control of the eastern Mediterranean. But back in Jerusalem, 2 Maccabees says that the former evil high priest Jason took 1,000 men after his own people and slaughtered many of them. Hearing this turmoil, Antiochus marched towards Jerusalem, taking the city because Jason let him in. This takes care of the Jerusalem piece on the prophecy. But once in, he killed many Jews, which 2 Maccabees says, "And there was the killing of young and old, making away of boys, women and children, slaying of virgins and infants." The total here was about 40,000 being killed and 40,000 being sold into slavery. So far, we have 3 of the 10 points met by 170 BC with Antiochus. A couple of years later, in 167, he starts checking off the other points as well. 1 Maccabees said that he attacked them again, and the nation was only becoming more sinful in this process because he was killing off the remaining faithful ones to God, which included killing people at the temple, which started his defilement of the temple. 1 Maccabees continues saying, "And King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that each should forsake his own laws, and all the nations agreed according to the word of the king. And many of Israel consented to his worship, and sacrificed to idols, and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by the hand of messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow laws of strange to the land, and should forbid whole burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the sanctuary, and should profane the Sabbaths and the feasts. Notice here that he is now outlawing Judaism. Verse 46. And pollute the sanctuary and those who were holy, that they should build altars and temples and shrines for idols, and should sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, and that they should leave their sons uncircumcised. 2 Maccabees gives us more specific details on this, saying, and also to pollute the sanctuary in Jerusalem, and to call it by the name of Jupiter Olympius. So the temple of Yahweh is now being called the temple of Zeus. And as paganism was being forced upon the temple, so does come pagan behavior with it, saying that in verse 4 that the temple was filled with riot and revelings by the heathen, who dallied with prostitutes and had to do with women within the sacred precincts, and moreover brought inside things that were not befitting. And the place of sacrifice was filled with those abominable things which had been prohibited by the laws. The abominable things should catch our attention. 1 Maccabees says, and on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they built an abomination of desolation upon the altar. Speaking of the pagan idol of Zeus here being erected in the temple. And then, 10 days later, Antiochus sacrificed upon the temple altar. Josephus expands on this, saying that Antiochus slew a pig upon the altar. And not just him himself did this, because he made the Jews build temples and raise idol altars in every city and village and offer swine upon them every day. So, we see how easily this satisfies the description of the little horn desolating the temple. Josephus also said, and if there were any sacred book of the law found, it was destroyed, and those with whom they were found miserably perished also. This fulfills the casting down of the truth by outlawing and destroying the Bible. But in all of this, some did remain faithful, but their faith brought with it extreme punishment. The men are said that every day underwent great miseries and bitter torments, for they were whipped with rods, and their bodies were torn to pieces, and were crucified while they were still alive and breathed. And they also strangled those women and their sons whom they had circumcised, as the king had appointed, hanging their sons about their necks as they were upon the crosses. And if you really need to know how gruesome this was, you need to go read chapter 7 in 2 Maccabees about how Antiochus made a mother watch her 7 sons being tortured and mutilated one by one to try to get them to renounce Judaism. So needless to say, we see how clearly Antiochus historically fulfills 5 more of these points. So how did he make himself equal to God? Well, we know that his original name was Mithridates. But then when he took on the throne, he changed his name to Antiochus, but also gave himself the nickname Epiphanes, which means God manifest. So Antiochus saw himself as an incarnate God. This is verified by the coins that he had minted with depictions of himself that included the phrase God manifested. And he also had Victory Bringer inscribed on them as well, where you can see the word Nike at the beginning of the phrase. So that only leaves us with the last point to cover, with the temple being cleansed after 2300 days. After Antiochus's abomination, 1 Maccabees goes into the Maccabean revolt, beginning with Matthias and his sons. Matthias died the year after Antiochus's sacrifice. This supports the early date for Daniel because in his farewell speech, he spoke about the fiery furnace and Daniel in the lion's den. This predates the critics' date by 3 years. And after this, chapters 3 and 4 cover the battles and victories of Judas Maccabeus. But at the end of chapter 4, it describes the cleansing of the temple. Verse 36. But Judas and his kindred said, Behold, our enemies are discomforted. Let's go up to cleanse the holy place and to dedicate it afresh. And all the army was gathered together, and they went up to Mount Zion. And they saw the sanctuary laid desolate, and the altar profaned, and the gates burned up, and shrubs growing in the courts as in a forest, or as on one of the mountains. And the priest chambers were pulled down as well. And Judas chose blameless priests, such as had pleasure in the law. And they cleansed the holy place, and bare out of the stones of defilement into an unclean place. And then they took counsel concerning the altar of burnt offerings, which had been profaned, with what they should do with them. And there came into their mind a good counsel that they should pull it down, lest it be a reproach to them, because the Gentiles had defiled it. And they pulled down the altar, and laid up the stones in the mountain of the house in a convenient place, until there should come a prophet to give an answer concerning them. And then in verses 52 and 53 tells us the exact day and year that this cleansing took place. So, the last part with the temple being cleansed is now also confirmed. So how does this play into the whole authorship debate? Well, without question, Antiochus is the little horn on the goat, to which something critics and 99% of Christians will agree on. Critics, though, will insist that he is also the little horn on the fourth beast. But we have already seen all the damage that is done with this, whether they try to end with the Seleucids or with the Greeks. But either way, they have now created another textual contradiction. The length of time that the little horns are to be oppressing the Jews now has a 3-year difference. If the writer or writers were trying to make them both speak about Antiochus, then the numbers would have been the same, especially since critics claim that the book was written in a retrospective manner. And historically speaking, 1st Maccabees just declared early authorship to the prophet Daniel, twice. First, we saw it with Matthias using Daniel and his 3 friends as examples of faith to encourage them. And the second time was with the cleansing of the temple, when they said that there was no prophet amongst them to tell them what to do with the altar stones that they took down. The 2 of these, side by side, clearly shows that the book of Daniel was understood to be composed in the 6th century BC and canonical well before the critics' date. And Josephus confirms for us that the Danielite prophecies were understood by the Jews, being about Antiochus saying, He also wrote and left behind him what made manifest the accuracy and undeniable veracity of his predictions, for he saith that when he was in Susa, that he wrote that out of one of them would arise another lesser horn, and that from among them there should arise a certain king that should overcome our nation and their laws, and should take away their political government, and should spoil the temple, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 3 years' time. And indeed, it so came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years before they came to pass. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.